Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Midnight Mass Episode 2. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. We're immediately picking up after the events of the last episode with the situation. The entire town is kind of like, oh, what's going on with these cats on the beach? Obviously, you have the sheriff being like, all right, everybody stay back. The mayor not wanting to necessarily listen. And I think it's so interesting, just like him like kind of prattling on like that, just the sheriff just going like, yep, it just feels so real, just kind of like him being like, oh yeah, there was a situation back in 2002. It's like, oh, do you think it has anything to do with the oil spill? It's like, oh no, like if it did, we probably would have smelled it, you know. It's like, oh, it was kind of, you know, and he just goes on and on. Then when they go over there to talk to Ed, he's like, oh yeah, Ed, can you believe this? That makes you think about back to 2002, and he basically starts that story over again, and just like you just see the sheriff just kind of like, yeah, you and me just had this. So it's just like he's kind of a talker, and just like, I don't know, like you kind of know that type of person. I don't know, like it's just it feels like. Not like it's a bad thing, but it's just kind of a thing of just like, I think on some level it reminds me of my dad, because I guess it's because my dad's like the stark opposite of me. My dad will talk to anyone. Like he's just, you know, I don't mean that in a bad thing. I'm envious of him because I'm the socially awkward person. I am like borderline antisocial. So like I get like, I think that's what it is. It kind of reminds me of my dad. Like he's really like ready to like strike up a conversation. He's kind of got that atmosphere and just aspect about him. So I think that's what that kind of reminds me of. I can't necessarily put a word to necessarily describing it. It was just I found that so interesting, and just like him going on and on, just like jumping like, yep. Obviously he wants to burn the bodies because it's like, all right, so maybe like, because at first it's like one of those cats was killed, but it's like, but there's no blood here, so it was either something that attacked it in the water or maybe on the island. But it's like, yeah, if it was a predator, it wouldn't explain all the dead cats. Once again, we only got to see that particular cat's wounds, but I'm guessing that's implying like the rest of the cats had similar wounds as well. But it's like, yeah, this many, like, he's just wanting to kill them. I mean, not kill them, Jesus. Burn them. Because it's like, we don't want to take the chance they might have like disease or something like that. So kind of better safe than sorry type of situation. You also have Beverly, who almost kind of thinks like, she just wants to kind of like ask him questions, and obviously like the sheriff sent Warren to kind of like shoo everybody away. But once again, the mayor decided to come down to the beach regardless. So we got a lot more interesting insight to a lot of stuff on the island. Like, for example, Lisa's circumstances as they were walking, and like she comes across Joe and Pike. She stops, and you're like, so what happened to her had something to do with him, because the moment he sees her, he kind of gets a little awkward. It's almost like, Pike, let's go. And so we find out later on what it was. It was kind of a quote-unquote hunting accident. But even later on, Riley's like, yeah, it wasn't really much of an accident, really. It's just like, he's like, Joe was shooting for shooting's sake, because it's like, there's no game around here to hunt. No big enough game around here to hunt. So it's like, he was just shooting for shooting's sake. And what happened to her happened to her. So it's like, okay, so he's the reason behind that, why she's, paralyzed. And so, speaking of Riley, we do get his, him leaving the island long enough to kind of go to his AA meeting. That's the only reason why he goes back to the mainland. And I love that as he's like doing that, he's about to walk past like Erin's place, and she's like, right, you're literally going to walk by not saying anything. And he's like, oh, I didn't want to bother you. And so he's kind of awkward around her, and she's like, how are you? Which is so interesting, because he's like, oh yeah, no one really asked me that. And his mom immediately asked him like afterwards, but I think it's a little bit of a different situation. Like, he wants to talk to Erin because they have their history. We really haven't gotten into it too much, but they have their history, and I think like her asking that means a lot. I think for his mom, it's just like, right, it's my mom asking, and it's just like, because she's so concerned, like, it's not really like, she's not really asking, like, I think for him, it's like, you're asking because you want a certain response. You want me to be like, oh, I'm good, I'm fine. Like, no, like, but with like Erin, he can be a little bluntly honest, which, speaking of Erin, that interaction she had with Beverly, once again, like, Beverly just like rubs everyone the wrong way. And so it's just kind of like, the moment she's like, oh, you looking for more Windex? It's like, you could always like, to keep it lasting a little bit longer, add water. It's like, well, I already threw the bottle away. It's like, oh, ain't that a gas? Your mom, like, she would pretty much keep every bottle. I mean, to the point, like, most of them were just filled with water, but you threw them away. Like, once again, it's just like, does everything that has to come out your mouth sound so backhanded? like I said, she's definitely going to, like I said, I know that archetype. It's like, ooh. And that actress does such a good job playing that. Just kind of like that like I said, holier than thou, like smugness. It's like that character is oozing smugness, especially when her saying like, right, you know, and there you are throwing those bottles on. It's like, yeah, my mom at a different story at home, she couldn't find a bottle she couldn't empty. It was like, ooh. And so it's kind of like, I think it's one of those things like everyone knew about that, and it's like, and Beverly's almost just kind of like walking past it. It's like, no, stew in that a little bit, like you had that remark, you know, and it's just. Then also she has that little rat poison or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, those rats are around. It's like, yeah, I can give, like, sprinkle it around your house or something like that. And she's like, no thanks. I'm curious at what she's saying that specifically is like, you know, it's just like, for one, she doesn't want to owe Beverly anything. It's like, I don't want you doing anything for me. Or is it like, also because she's pregnant, so maybe she's worried about, like, even if it's just around the house, maybe that rat poison might have some negative effect on her pregnancy. And maybe that's also kind of the thing too, that like, right, you would, that even, like, I'm not saying it would. I'm not a person enough to know, like, I'm not person enough to know what the hell am I saying? I don't know enough to know if that would actually have an effect on her pregnancy or whether that was one of the reasons. But the way she talks about it later on, it's like, right, she's like, yeah, like, Beverly's telling me how great my awful of a mother is, as well as kind of slut-shaming me. Because I guess it's like, maybe it's just like, maybe she had like a promiscuous past or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's like, maybe it's about her current baby situation, whatever the case may be. She was like, yeah, like, Beverly, like I said, she just like, she kind of looks down upon everybody. So there was some interesting aspects about this episode too, in the sense of like, it does seem like there are little miracle things happening here and there. Like, well, at one point Riley decides to go and help his dad on the fishing boat. He's just like, I just want to be useful. And his dad at one point is like lifting something. He's like, Dad, you're back. He's like, no, I'm good. I'm like, is that supposed to be like, because we see later on, like, Annie's like doing her thing, and she like pokes her finger and it's bleeding a little bit. She's looking through her glasses, and she has a Spider-Man moment where she like has her glasses and is blurry, lift them up and her vision's fine, and you notice throughout the rest of the episode she's not wearing her glasses anymore. It's like no one says anything about it, but it's like, oh, little things here and there, and I'm like, what's that all about? So it almost seems like I said, I get the feeling like, obviously we'll get to the ending, but it's like, there definitely seem to be like little miracles popping up here and there. Father Paul definitely like put his foot down, not foot down, but he really got into it with like what he was saying, like, oh, it's just interesting, like, because even Beverly made a comment about like, oh, it's interesting how people only, like, everyone in town's rolling up in the church on when it's like Easter or Christmas, and even he was calling him out, but basically being like, the fact is, you've been dealt a bad hand, but the fact is, God will help you kind of through all that. And everyone was kind of feeling it, even like Ed kind of shaking his head, like, yeah, because it's like, right, he will, like, it was a whole conversation, because this is around Easter, so it's about rebirth and resurrection, and it's like, yeah, this island will rise again. You know, it's like, oh, what if some of his apostles, like the first one was a fisherman, you know, and it's like I said, you can see Ed getting into it, everyone's getting into it, and even Beverly being like, oh, captivated, even Annie's like crying from it. It's just like, okay, like everyone's kind of getting swept up in the words of it. But despite all that, like the next time it's like, oh, no one showed up. No one did the usual customers like Annie and Lisa, for example. So I think that's fascinating. Another interesting element, and I skipped over this a little bit at the beginning, was the conversation. It was kind of what I talked about before with the sheriff and his son, of like, right, kind of being like the new people, but also like you seem like outliers in the town, in the sense of like, you're, because it's like, oh, like, you know, the mayor being like, oh, you should, you know, come by the church. And I mean, it's like, not major, just like, you know, maybe read off some stuff about being part of the community, and rather than being separate, because it's better for the community as a whole, and just kind of like, because it's like, you know, he was like, yeah, because I know you go to the mainland to go to mosque. He's like, yeah, on Fridays. It's like, oh, so you're available on Sundays. It just, like I said, it's just that awkward thing of almost like, yeah, okay, like, I think for the sake of everything, he's just, because later on, he's just like, yeah, he shows up at that event and whatnot, the crop potluck, just because like he knows it's like, right, I gotta make more of an attempt. We have to make more of an attempt to like connect with the town. Like we don't have to like convert her or anything, but it's just like it's going to be a little less awkward. It's like we are here, we are part of the community and everything, so we have to at least like lean into that more, just not to stand out too much. So I just thought that was kind of a fascinating element to that. But at the speaking of the potluck, it is this interesting thing where once again Riley's bringing up the fact it's like, yeah, I thought I saw Monsignor Pruitt. It's like, yeah, but it can't be. He's on the mainland and everything. It's like, yep. Just like you could just tell, it seemed like Paul was just kind of like pulling that out of his ass type of situation of like, yeah, but I mean, yeah, circumstances. Like, yeah, I just talked to him the other night before the storm. And that was after the ferries had already closed down. So I was like, unless he swam here. And it's like, ha 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 ha. And I mean, you know, so covering his bases. I don't know if I didn't talk about it too. Maybe I think it was this episode because I'm already blurring like episode 1 in this. But I think if you notice, like he is a little like Beverly hasn't had to call him out on the fact that he's wearing the wrong like colors or whatever. So it's like he definitely made sure to fix that so he wouldn't draw too much of her attention in that regard. But he ends up talking to Riley about, it's like, right, Pruitt is like, oh, I don't think he's going to get any better. And it's like, everything has its seasons. And he's like, right, your mom told me about you going to the mainland for AA. It's like, well, we could start a chapter here because he's like, yeah, everyone's, got their issues. So it's like, right, like you could basically do a lot of good by, you kind of opening the door because like everyone has their, struggles with alcohol or whatever. So it's like you could open the doorway of leading to something good. You could be like, your helping start something here could lead to other people like being able to have a chapter of kind of like the AA meetings here. So I thought that was fascinating. I also thought it was interesting too when Sarah is on her date or whatever, because like I think her significant other's kind of like, I mean, I think that's seemed like that was like what that was implying. Like I guess it's still relatively new because it sounded like it was like, oh, a second date. But Sarah is looking and she's like, huh. And this kind of got me thinking. I was like, that's interesting that she was saying that the look that Father Paul was giving her, she was like, yo, yeah, like he's everyone else's like religious like Monsignor like father and stuff like that, but not mine. But she's like, yeah, the way he's giving me those looks is like the same look that Monsignor Pruitt would give me. She's like, just staring at me in the same way. It's just like, even when I was younger, it's like he knew on some level, I guess, like, because it's like the probably like awkwardness of it. That's why she doesn't go to church, because it's like probably doesn't align with who she is. Maybe that's kind of what that is. But I'm like, the fact is that she was saying like, oh yeah, like he's but I'm like, I was about to say like, because part of me was like, he couldn't be like Pruitt who aged down. It's like, no, because if he was, people would have pointed out like, you look a lot like, because a lot of them were on the island to know him when he was younger-ish. So that wouldn't be a possibility. But I just thought it was interesting that Sarah pointed that out. Like, oh, like, is that a problem? Or is that just kind of like him just like getting the lay of the lands? Like he does linger his eyes and focus on certain people. Like he makes more of an attempt in certain... I don't know what to make of it. Like, whether that was just something, like, just on Sarah's side of things, or whether that's going to be something significant. Like, that the fact is that she noticed that will be important later on. I don't know. It could have just meant nothing. It could have just been a little thing. Maybe it has bigger implications. I don't know. I had a feeling things were going to go bad with Pike the moment they focus on him eating a hot dog. And I was like, what is that? I was like, oh, please don't. Like, immediately I just had this weird feeling. I was like, please don't let nothing happen to that dog. And lo and behold, something happens to the dog. I was like, and he's whimpering. I was like, oh no. And he got killed. And it seems like he was poisoned. And like, I love that you see Aaron immediately turn to Beverly being like, I know that we were just having a conversation about rat poison. And here's, it's like, yeah. I thought that was so fascinating. But yeah, he's crying over his dog. Joe, sheriff, the sheriff has to come over to Joe to be like, no, it's okay. And he's like, one of you had to done it. He had to be poisoned. And Sarah's like, yeah, maybe he just ate something accidentally. He's like, no, an accident. You think it was an accident? And he looks at Lisa, and it's kind of like, he kind of like puts his head down in shame because it's like, right, here you are about to cause a scene about like, oh, do you think it's really an accident? When the same thing could have been said about yours and Lisa's circumstances beforehand. So it's like, he kind of has to keep quiet, but he's just like, oh, my good boy. And I was like, oh, that's so heartbreaking. But it's like, yeah, the moment you could just see Aaron like looking at Beverly, and Beverly's almost like, oh, well, whatever. And so with, I was like, the moment the sheriff shows up, I was like, oh, like Aaron pointed him in that direction. He keeps it very like anonymous on like, he's like, yeah, people just, about that compound of yours, the poison and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's so interesting. I was like, I wondered if she know it was Aaron, because Aaron did see her with it, and, like threw that out there. Because it's like, because she's like, oh, you hear about the cats, all that happens. Like, no, the dog. And it's like, okay. And once again, that smug slyness, too, of just her being like, oh, is that what you're saying, Sheriff? Because I think I know what you're saying. Is that what you're actually saying? Because she's like, yeah, like, if it was, like, if I was at all responsible and it was an accident, just, she's just so, like, and just, like, you could tell, like, he can see, like, how, like, she's feigning it, but it's like, so you did do it on purpose. That screams like she did it, and she's just so like arrogant about it, almost flaunting, like, oh yeah, almost like, oh yeah, I did it. But I mean, if I did, I'd be so brokenhearted by the fact that I did what I did, And so the sheriff visits Joe later on, and we get a little peek into this conversation, but it's like she's responsible for like the compensation. You're like, what's that about? Well, we find out that the oil company and all that stuff, with what happened, that's basically affected the town's livelihood. She's the one that pushed for them to sign the deal. And it's like, yeah, at the time it seemed like a lot of money, but then when you compensate a lot of people for the lost wages, it ended up not being as much as you thought it would be. So it's like, because Riley kind of calls her out for like later on being like, yeah, it's because of her, like the town's in the state that is in. That's why so many people have left, because like that money ran dry, and just like, so it's almost like, that's why I feel like there's some part of the town that seems like they have their contention with Beverly, and I think that contributes to part of that. Especially when you add in that she was saying like, oh, you should definitely give some of that money to the church, to God, and Monsignor Pruitt wasn't in the best state of mind at the time, so the money kind of went to her. But it's like, right, we can't necessarily have that money go to her, so it went to the rec center. So it's like, that's why it's kind of like, because I think for him, it's just him and maybe others. Definitely for Joe's purpose, it's like, yeah, because he even said it, like, yeah, you can hate me, that's fine, but why would you do it to my innocent boy, Pike? But it's like, yeah, like, because even he was saying, like, Joe was saying, like, ever since he knew her back in grade school, like, Beverly's always been that hateful type of person in certain regards. So it's like, it was definitely her. Like, you don't know her like I know her, which even, the sheriff is like, he's like, Azan's like, oh, you're right. I might not know her as well as you do, but I do believe you that she was the one responsible for this. So I do know that, so I got your back in that. So he's almost like, thank you, because it's like, he's the town drunk and everything. So like the entire town's against him anyway. And Beverly's just kind of helping lead that charge. So, it's like, right, people disliking me, hate me for what I've done. Understandable. But come on, like, she's done what she's done so they're the only ones that have spoken out. Well, so far we've only had 3 characters, technically 4, really kind of call out Beverly. The sheriff's not too keen on her. Aaron definitely isn't. So is Joe and Riley. Like, they're the only ones that are willing to kind of speak out. I guess everyone else is a little too, like, it's kind of almost that like, you hold your tongue type of thing, especially with her connection to the church and stuff like that. Like, I don't think many people would call her out for her circumstance, for being who she is, or the way that she behaves, or all that she's done, so I think that's interesting. But kind of talking about the Riley situation, he did sit down and talk with the Father Paul, and it's a whole conversation about, like, he didn't want to go too deep into conversation about religion because, it's like, I don't want to offend, but Paul's like, I don't offend easily. So he like, what we really get into is like his perspective on things, in particular, like Riley's, where it's like he kind of comes at things from a more psychological standpoint of like his alcoholism and just like that part of himself. Because essentially Paul was saying like alcohol isn't good or bad. It basically comes down to the person. Because Riley was talking about how it's not fair. Like, it's like you talk about God, and it's like it's a conversation beforehand about like how I talked about this, I think, a little bit in the last episode, why he kind of lost his religion, where it's like, yeah, like a God that like creates suffering won't lend out a hand. Like the fact is that I killed someone, and like the fact is that I'm essentially that he's still here, that it's like the fact is that like a God allows all this suffering. It's a situation where like Lisa will never walk again, that a man like Joe drowns himself in his drinking, that basically it's like there's supposed to be like something good can come from suffering, but it's kind of like what, like it's kind of like, what's the point? What kind of, like, if there is such a God or whatever, like, why would, and that's the age-old, like, question, that kind of gets thrown at religion in general, I think. It's just kind of like, if there is this, like, loving God, then why is there, like, suffering and stuff like that in the first place? But once again, it's just like, Paul's perspective is, like, it's all, that's something good. Like, it's almost like, not necessarily, he doesn't use the word test, but I think that's something that kind of gets thrown around a bit, is like, it's a test, something good, like to take the bad that's happened in your life and you could do something good with it, essentially. And I think it speaks volumes that, like, that ties into the, let's go ahead and talk about it, the Lisa situation, where he's focusing on her the entire time, and then he, like, backs away from her, and she tries to, like, roll forward, but he's like, no, the body of Christ. And she ends up standing up, and everyone's like, whoa. Because at first they're like, what are you doing? Like, stop being cruel. And it, like, she gets up and is like, whoa. And it's like, yeah, she's walking again. And she's like, he's like, the body of Christ. And she's like, amen. So it's like, he kind of took something Riley said and created a miracle from it, almost. Like, that seems like just the fact, the timing, it's like, he could have, not saying he could have done it any time, but the fact is he did it. Because I think more so than anything, if he can like captivate the entire town to follow him, like I said, I think it's going to become that thing of like, he creates these miracles and that's going to cause a division in town. That was kind of my theory going into this, but I think in particular, if he can get Riley to change his point of view, like, I think that will cement a lot. Like, if you can make a non-believer a believer again, I think that will hold a lot of weight. That's why I'm almost like, some of the stuff he listed off, like Joe's drinking, I'm wondering, is that going to get conquered in a different episode? Because if it does, like, it's going to be like him taking every issue that Joe had, not Joe, but that Riley had, and kind of like, oh, look what's happening now. Like, I think that seems so purposeful. It's just interesting that this would happen right after Paul and Riley would have that very conversation. So we'll see what happens. I'd actually skipped over this earlier in the episode too, as the fact is that Paul stopped by to talk to Sarah's mom, and at first she thought it was John, Monsignor Pruitt, and it's like, oh, no, Mom, it's not, this is Father Paul, and he's like, and like the way he's like so gentle with her, part of me is like, there's something there, like, because at one point, like, he does such a little thing of like buttoning her shirt up a little bit more, and they made, because even Sarah had to walk out, because I guess for her it was like, right, it was so quiet, because she was like, yeah, if my mom has an episode, come and get me, like, I'll be here. But it's like, she comes out because I think it was so quiet, and she kind of sees like, right, like, I think maybe she never gets to see her mom that calm or something, so like, him having some calming effect over, that's why I'm like, it's the little miracles throughout the episode, and like the bigger miracle I outwardly like noticed miracle was at the end, but it's like, it's little things throughout the episode that I'm like, I don't know, because there was even the fact is that, like, because obviously he knew about Lisa's circumstances, so like when she was, stopped and looked at Joe and the dog, and I'm like, it's hard to say like whether that was Beverly, because she was lying and saying like, well, she was saying like, oh, no one locks this up, so it seems like it could have been and would have been her, but it's like, could it have been Father Paul as well, because the whole conversation about like, oh yeah, like, good could come from suffering, because I guess maybe it's like by losing Pike, maybe this could be the road towards him getting sober and stop drinking. I don't know. Because that's also an interesting thing, too. I'm a little scatterbrained with this. It's just because a lot of this has come to my mind of like, oh, yeah, I didn't talk about that. There's a conversation about, like, at the potlucks, it's like, oh, those tickets, you can turn, like, 3 of them in to get, like, a drink or something. But it's like, yeah, the people who shouldn't be drinking, Erin and Riley, are getting the tickets. But she's like, she remembers her mom would go around collecting everyone's tickets and end up drinking, and just that being the issue. And obviously she's scared of, like, because like for her it's like, I'm in my mom's footsteps, I've taken the same job she has, I'm living in the same place she had, I'm sleeping in the same bed that she slept in, I'm the same way as her too, I'm alone. But like, you know, Riley's like, no matter what it is, you know, being a mom, being a teacher, like you'll be awesome, you'll be great, like, you know, because I know what kind of person you are, you're not your mom. Like, he's like, I might not know you well enough all across the board, but I know that well enough to know who you are at your core, type of situation. So, but another fascinating aspect of this episode is the creature or whatever it is, because there's like multiple sightings throughout the episode, because it's like, one, the fact is that Erin's looking out her window at one point in time and sees kind of like the Pruitt shaped person, maybe being or thing, that Riley saw, and it runs away. But then at one point, Sarah's mom is screaming like, oh my God, like, I saw your dad. And it's like, Dad's been dead for 15 years, Mom. But she's like, I saw that thing. Its face. It just came up to the window and scared the crap out of her. There's that. Then there's like the swooping, like, once again, the thing of Ochre, who keeps coming across the thing of like, the wingspan thing of like he saw on Upper's Island. And all of a sudden he hears it because we see it flying, and it goes into a very specific house. This very same house ends up being one that Bull walks by and ends up getting attacked by this creature because this thing has full-blown wings. And I'm like, he's walking by the house, I'm like, that house is I didn't even realize at the time that was the same house it swooped down on, but I was like, the way the camera angle was, that door's gonna creak open. And lo and behold, it creaks open. I was like, don't do it. But he's like, is someone there? And then it repeats what he said. And I was like, wait, is this thing a mimic? Like, are we dealing with because like maybe it doesn't know human language, so like it like pretends to be human. Like, that's why I'm like, maybe that's what he saw when he thought he saw Pruitt. Like, maybe it's this thing, like, when it's in its weakened state, when it hasn't had enough to feed on, it just like, it pretends to be, or maybe like those are two separate things, Pruitt and this thing, because this thing was like there on the island, on upwards, potentially, you know. Well, no, definitely, because Ochre saw its giant wingspan, plus Warren saw it. But also it's like there's been 2 other sightings, you know, from Sarah's mom as well as Erin. So I'm like, I don't know. Like, why is it in its wing state in some cases and not in others? I mean, immediately what came to my mind, I was like, oh, very like Jeepers Creepers in certain regards. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But like I said, just like the fact is the way it talks, I'm like, it seems like kind of a mimic, like it has to throw, because it's like, right, you say something and it throws it back. But poor Bull gets it. He gets grabbed by the creature. Once again, you know, like any good horror story, don't really get a good enough look at it right now. So I guess it's just hiding out there throughout the day. Like, it's one of those abandoned houses where it's like, because no one's like buying those properties, so they're just staying left alone. So like, no one's going to go looking. Like, why would anyone have any reason to go to those properties? So we'll see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But things are picking up, and it's going to be interesting to see where it all goes, where it all takes us going forward. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.